Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. So this video is about the coronavirus fallout. I'm not even sure I have this one the right way around. And actually I read that it's completely ineffectual. In fact, it can make it worse because it somehow traps germs closer to the nostrils and the oral cavity. And so I'm more likely to ingest some infectious particles. I don't know what to believe these days. There's so much contradictory advice out there. This thing is, oh, ibuprofen was found in the system of certain people who succumbed to COVID-19. Therefore, does that exacerbate it if you catch it, or mean that you're going to catch it when you otherwise wouldn't do? I don't know. Or maybe there's no causal link here. It could just be people sometimes take ibuprofen to deal with the headache that's occasioned by this malady, and it doesn't aggravate the situation. It could be a mere coincidence. Anyhow, so worldwide we've got about 8,000 deaths and counting. So the fatality rate is anything between 1 and 7% of those who contract the disease. Obviously, how many people have caught the disease worldwide? Is it thought to be about 200,000? Now, we can only know that if someone's actually been diagnosed with it, if they've been presented. They might have died before they've ever been presented, and that's not been determined the cause of death. Some people have caught it, just not gone. They're in denial or live in a country with very limited health care or whatever. Could there be some false positives? Just possibly. And about half of those who've caught it have already recovered. I had a bad flu for about 2 weeks in the middle of February, and it crossed my mind, looking back, did I actually have coronavirus and make it without any medical intervention? I mean, unlikely. Far more probable scenario is that it was just an ordinary influenza, and I got through it in the ordinary way. But it makes me reflect that so many of the scourges of modern times, bubonic plague, SARS, swine flu, avian flu, coronavirus, K-pop, they all come out of the Far East. Could it be because people have pullulated there for millennia, and it's the most densely populated region of our planet? I mean, not wishing to be xenophobic. Okay, I know the Koreans aren't Chinese, but let's not split hairs. Anyway, Russia's reporting only roughly 130 cases and not a single fatality arising from coronavirus. Is that remotely credible? Really? 145 million people, and they've only got 130 cases or so? The United Kingdom, which is much further from China, it's got 70 million people, not even, has got well over 1,000 cases and has had 123 deaths. Is that right? I mean, the numbers are increasing by the hour. China's got a huge border with Russia. China's their biggest trading partner. The single biggest tourist nationality to visit Russia is China. And the Chinese are going there. Chinese New Year is in early February. It's huge then. And I don't think they close the border quite by that point. So China claims to have under control, and the number of infections is growing only slowly because the measures have worked. Now, China is gigantic, of course, and it was one particular province in particular, Hubei, and some Chinese provinces are less affected than some Western nations, such as Spain and Italy. It could be, of course, that it's just massive scale state lying, as would be the case in China. You know, like 1 million Uyghurs detained without trial or charge in China. That's that Turkic ethnic minority who live in the very western region of Xinjiang. And that they are Sunni Mohammedans. And for several years, the Chinese government lied, stonewalled, claimed that they were not detained. Okay, and that was a flagrant lie. So even they eventually came clean about that. So who would credit anything that Beijing said when they've lied about something? Oh, don't touch the face. They're for re-education and blah, blah, blah. That massively downplays all the things it's done, like the Great Leap Forward, like all the purges in the 60s. The Chinese government really doesn't care about the welfare of its people. It's poisoning them with fumes just so that some people can get richer. But, you know, as Saraiva Novello wrote, there's a silver lining through the dark cloud shining. Because the factories are less active, because fewer people are driving and fewer planes are flying, their air quality is higher than it's been for decades. But that's what it is. But that's obviously a bit of a threat to the Chinese regime, because the Chinese will be reminded of what it's like to breathe normally. And they would like this all the time. And air quality in even Occidental cities has improved. So over to Donald J. Now, Donald John Trump. has worsened the situation very considerably. As recently as the 28th of February, he was telling his rally the whole thing was a hoax. To say this is a fallacy, I mean, why is the bloke not swinging from a lamppost for saying that? As though the Democrats would make this up. Like 2 months ago, Joe Biden was publishing articles saying that this was a major challenge and the government had to get serious about tackling it. Now, the US administration did not invent coronavirus, did not spread it, but they didn't do very much to prevent it spreading. I realize that a responsible government would not panic the people, nor would it overreact. But underreacting is also bad. What would be an overreaction, what would be an underreaction is difficult to judge. But put it this way, I don't think any fair-minded commentator would say Trump has handled this well by first of all telling the blatant falsehood to say that the coronavirus didn't exist. An obvious fallacy. He's lied so much. Anyway, a lot of his irrational and anti-scientific morons who support him, and I say that advisedly, will be killed by this because they are people of faith. They don't believe in science, don't believe in evolution, and they'll be going to their mega churches and praying to fend off the disease. Look how well that worked out during bubonic plague. And obviously gathering in huge groups is exactly the wrong thing to do. And Russia, I mean, you've got to give them credit where it's due, has said the Orthodox Church, no, you can't have a march to pray against this. Your orisons are not going to work. You've got to be a medical science. No, you can't gather. Okay, so you have to patter privately. And if your incantations have something to them, they don't need to be in a large group. So now Trump has often been citing the stock market as an indicator of his competence as a president. But the vagaries of the stock market are only partly linked to what the president does. The president can't do that much to improve it, but by some unguarded words, he can knock a lot off the NASDAQ or indeed the FTSE. Not the FTSE, sorry, that's in the United Kingdom, or the Dow Jones. But the stock market obviously disproportionately benefits the super wealthy. This percolation economics has been debunked decades ago, but it's a sort of a lie that will not die. Anyway, Trump has made himself a hostage to fortune. If the stock market is a litmus test of his stewardship of the economy, what's it like now? Haven't we had the worst fall since 1987? So even by his own rationale, judging by that yardstick, he's been an utterly moronic president. He couldn't have been more imbecilic. Just look how absolutely catastrophic he's been. Now, although I think he has been a terrible president, I think, as I say, I don't think I can blame him that much for the stock market. Partly, he could have done much better in all sorts of ways, in economic policy, but even in the way he dealt with this disease by first of all telling the plain truth that yes, it exists and it is fairly serious. He could have said at the beginning, and we've got it under control when they hadn't, and then he acknowledges that it's completely out of control. But he could have taken precipitate action. Sometimes I think some of the things suggest it would have been too hasty. People say the United Kingdom should have gone into lockdown a while ago. Now, I've got no background in medical sciences, but the UK government's got this theory that there's herd immunity, that you've got to let a little bit of it get around, and then we are hardened to it, and then we're more likely to cope with it. Obviously, isolate those who are immunocompromised. Some people have their immune system somewhat suppressed due to various drugs to prepare them to receive an organ transplant, or they're just very elderly, or women who are with child, various things like that. Those people need to be taken out of circulation because their immune system is not robust enough to take it. But if your constitution is fairly sturdy, you can take it. Now, I'm just going along with the expert advice. I know it's a contentious topic. The trouble is COVID-19 is a new thing, and this is educated guesswork. And if we get it wrong, the consequences are additionally hundreds of thousands of deaths. The UK government said if we get away with sustaining fewer than 20,000 deaths in the United Kingdom, we're doing well. So they're wise to prepare us for a grave situation. Now, the stock market has plummeted, but I think if I were an investor, I'd be buying shares in hand sanitizer, funeral care, and what else? Possibly face masks. So, there are always a few winners, no matter how cataclysmic the economic collapse. Trump actually shut down the pandemic unit of the US government when he came into office. So that would have dealt with the situation rather better. He couldn't stop it completely, but it's about minimising the death toll. We can't prevent all deaths, no. Within the UK, the projection, the worst case scenario, is 500,000 deaths by the end of the year. Now, cast our minds back to the Spanish flu, 1918. More people were killed in that than were killed in the First World War. About 1% of the world's population died in just a few months from the Spanish flu. That's partly because we were debilitated due to malnutrition going to the First World War. Some people were already ill and or wounded. Not enough doctors, nurses, drugs, equipment, everything. We're not in such a bad situation in that regard. But I don't think anyone thinks as much as 1% of the world population is going to die. In the UK, the worst case scenario is about 0.8% of the population. 0.4% of the population dying would be very bad. 0.1% of the population, that would still be terrible. But I think, well, it's a fool's errand. Perhaps I shouldn't just be plucking figures out of the air. Obviously, if it's somebody whom I love, then that would be a very heavy blow. So, yeah, and Trump, remember he was so admiring of Vladimir Putin, and the media in Russia is almost entirely state-owned, either directly or indirectly. One of Putin's sycophants in the press the other day said, without Putin, Russia's a failed state. Now, Russia doesn't have the rule of law. There's an awful lot wrong with his governance, but it certainly wouldn't be a failed state without him. Only a complete arse-licker would say that. And Putin does so much to screw up the country. And even I, who was a day one abominator of him, I acknowledge he's got a few things right. But anyway, Trump's once admirers in the Russian press corps, they've said that the United States invented coronavirus. Yeah, right, which has obviously affected the US as well. But funnily enough, if the Americans really hate Russia, how come only 130 Russians have got it? Now, say what you like about the CIA, but they're not incompetent. It's the Russian security services, or the bunglers, who don't even manage to kill Sergei Skripal and leave their fingerprints all over it. But back to Trump. Remember, this is the man who said that he would eliminate the national debt in 8 years. Eliminate the national debt. No one's ever come anywhere close to that. And he's managed to add $3 billion to the national debt in 3 years. Sorry, $3 billion. What am I talking about? $3 billion is chump change. $3 trillion. $3 trillion in 3 years. So this is going to affect tourism in general, the hospitality trade, restaurants, hotels, airlines, tour companies, and golf courses, Donald. Anyway, so within the UK, Flybe has already gone bust, but the government was saving it. Virgin Atlantic, that might go bust. Well, I get a bit of schadenfreude out of that. Wipe the smile off that beardo's face, that crony of Tony Blair, who was taking taxpayers' money to subsidise his private railway. What on the hell was that about? But why should we save them? You set up a business, you take a risk. You know when you've got a travel company, there could be an act of God that could screw you over. Well, tough. It's not publicly owned, and you're not going to pay us back at the commercial rate of interest. Another airline will step in and pick up the slack. And we're reminding ourselves we can actually survive without flying around the world all the time. We can work from home. Fortunately, technology allows us to do that. But yeah, it is inconvenient, and I want to be able to go to the park and go around and see people. Anyway, we can't let the economy slow down so much. That's why I think complete shutdown would be foolish, because we've got to pay for all this. We've got to pay for healthcare, and we shouldn't be bailing out companies. We need that money to pay for healthcare, to buy more ventilators and things like that. And that's why also part of the strategy in the UK is there's going to be a spike. Is to if it's the same number of people who sustain the disease, to spread it over a longer period of time, rather than have a very sharp spike. Italy's taken drastic measures, and I suppose they had to, because it was just so bad. They couldn't afford it to get any worse, because it was killing people. Not just coronavirus victims, people who had something completely unrelated, like a heart attack, because you've only got so many doctors and nurses, and you can't be in two places at once. And if there are two people who are both critically ill, and one of them's got a heart attack, and one of them's kind of towards the end stage of corona, who do you choose? Because if they're both savable, who do you choose? And so the Italians were saying, we're just going to do this on age. If you're over 80 and you've got coronavirus, we're just not going to intervene, because you're not salvageable. We've got to spend staff time saving those who can still be saved. Anyway, so yeah, the theory in the UK was we can't let it swamp the health system, and so that's why we have to let it get round a little bit and build up an immunity and deal with it. And this lockdown, people are not going to live with that forever. We're not a totalitarian state like China. We're not used to people aren't used to being bossed around. People are quite bolshy in the UK, quite anti-authoritarian. There are very few police officers here. They run off their feet as it is. Most of the time, they're just filling out forms. But it actually might have some positive long-term effects, because the NHS said, we can't bother with filling on the computer, we'll just save the patient. Because doctors and nurses spend half their time on the computer. It's not their fault, it's the regulations. Like anyone else, teachers or whoever spend half their time producing reams and reams of documentation which are no good to anyone and actually take them away from doing the crucial job. And knock doctors and nurses could return to practice course for months and months, just bring them back. And schools can't cope. Some of the elderly teachers, they're going to have to stay at home because they're in the danger zone for catching the disease. We're going to have drafted other people who are not teachers, graduates, and we can't bother with the paperwork. We'll just have them back. And couldn't this last? We can see that we can actually do without paperwork. So maybe go back to a simpler life, which would be fantastic. Schools in the UK are about to be closed. They were iffy about this because then that would take some from frontline emergency workers away from work, because they have to look after their children. They're toddlers, they can't be left on their own. You don't want to have the grandparents looking after them because they're too old, and on and on. So the idea was to, if you have to have a lockdown, have it a bit later, have it in April or something like that, and not for that long, because people will start cheating on it more and more, and a trickle of people breaking the rules becomes a flood, and then you just, there's no point in trying to enforce something which is completely unenforceable. And as we get to good weather, it's increasingly difficult to have people on lockdown because they're tempted to be outside. So the idea was to deal with the worst of it in as warm weather as possible. The one thing is not to have it re-attacking in winter when the National Health Service is creaking under strain even at the best of times. So I noticed some countries have got rather higher rates of medical staff per capita. So bring in loads of Cuban doctors, why not? But even European Union countries like Luxembourg. So this thing about the herd immunity is only a theory. It could be dead wrong, and I mean dead in the very literal sense, because we can't do it both ways for the sake of an experiment. These are projections based on various virology models. Anyway, so many economic gains of the last few years may well be wiped out for this. Think of Italy and Spain, and to some extent France. Ironically, the countries that have to go and lock down the ones that are most reliant on the tourist euro, and had to say closing hotels, restaurants, nightclubs, but things like tourist attractions, museums, galleries. And when are we going to return to normality? Depends what you mean, like what level of normality. 3 months? 2 months? I mean, a month is the most optimistic. But you can't keep this up forever. People have got to be able to go to the supermarket and pharmacies. It is. People have got to be able to distribute medicines and food, therefore. Because we can live without buying clothes for a while. There's minimal public transport. You go down to a Sunday service. But on the other hand, that means more people on the train or bus. So more risk. If I get onto a train that's empty, I feel less nervous about it. And it was great for cycling because the streets are virtually empty. So I see oil prices are very low because fewer people are flying, factories aren't producing so much. So down to $30 a barrel, which has really fucked over Russia, which is quite dependent on hydrocarbons for its economy. Anyway, so Russia failed to agree a deal with OPEC about a production cut. But they'd had this for several years, but some people like the CEO of Rosneft, the Russian state oil company, was always against that deal. He's very glad to have his way, but it's just not going to redound to Russia's advantage. The United States has got shale oil. They thought, oh, we'll bankrupt shale oil, but they can easily just not produce for a while. Russia's got relatively high production costs, maybe because it's got oil and gas in cold areas. On the other hand, it's inefficiency and peculation by people in the oil business, creaming it off for the kleptocracy. So the United States can buy Saudi oil, bolster their ally there, strengthen them against Iran and against Russia. And also Russia's relationship with Saudi Arabia has gone a bit sour because they failed to agree a deal. They've been quite childish about it. It's been brinksmanship, not willing to make minor concessions for the sake of achieving a deal. So Russia could be hit with further sanctions. If I was NATO, if I really wanted to force them to retreat on NATO, on Ukraine, I might do that. Because even if you don't succeed, you make them pay a very heavy price. Therefore, they've got less money to spend on everything else. And public opinion in Russia might force some sort of back down. Well, we really don't want to suffer like this. The government's not completely indifferent to public opinion. They do try and shape it, and to a large extent are successful through total control of the media and the internet and criminalizing anyone who tells the truth or expresses a dissident opinion. So, yeah, Anyway, now we're seeing what it is like to spend more time at home. Read those books you didn't have time to read. Watch the YouTube channel you didn't have time to watch. And no commuting. Isn't it a delight? Go to the park, stay away from others. Family life, I know, isn't it unbearable? Cook at home. Wow, slow food. Gardening. DIY. Online learning. So, how long can you take it before you go stir crazy? So, that's my penny's worth of thoughts on the coronavirus fallout. I mean, the UK is talking about sort of 12 weeks of special measures. Seems to be about right for me. But I'm, it's just not funny because someone who's slightly older than me died in this. That one of the minor mercies is that no child, and certainly the UK, has died from it. I think very few children worldwide have died from it. I mean, probably the single biggest risk factor for this is age. So you can't rejuvenate. Anyway, that's enough from me. So please make sure you follow me on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. Subscribe. Good night.